Good morning. My name is Justin Hansford. I am the Executive Director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law. And I'd like to welcome everybody to the Protest and Police Force panel on examining racial discrimination and the legality of police force in the United States here this morning. The tragic killing of Mike Brown and George Floyd and the ongoing disproportionate killings of Black and Brown people by law enforcement in the United States has sparked demonstrations in all 50 states and around the world. In response, police have unleashed tear gas, rubber bullets, and other weapons against protesters in ways that arguably violate international law. Today, we're going to have a conversation with experts from around the world, including professors, special rapporteurs from the United Nations, former police chief, and other experts who can talk directly about the implications of these things that have happened to our nation and our world in recent months and what some solutions might be going forward. In lieu of giving lengthy introductions, what we're going to do today is start with our urgent question, and in responding, the panelists will also provide introductions of themselves. And without further ado, I want to begin and ask the question: what do you see as the advantages to taking a human rights approach to addressing issues of racial discrimination and excessive use of force and police violence, particularly in the United States? What are the advantages of a human rights approach to addressing these issues? I want to begin with Gay McDougall. Please feel free to answer the question.
Well, thank you, Justin, and thank you to the organizers of this panel and to my co-panelists. I am currently adjunct at Fordham Law School and in the International Center for Race, Policy, and Law, and the Leitner Center there. But I've spent much of my career as a UN, what we call independent expert, 8 years on the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and 6 years as Special Rapporteur on minorities around the world. I think that the added advantage of using international law in the US context is, well, it's multiple. First of all, it's an additional authoritative voice, and one that I think speaks well to the American population. Secondly, I think that these are standards that the U.S. has agreed to, has voluntarily ratified treaties and other documents, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which everyone knows. But the other document that I think is rarely quoted in the U.S., especially in this context, is the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And the advantage there is that the standards are much broader than U.S. law. And in this context particularly, the U.S. law has many problems about finding a disparate impact of racially harmful laws as being actionable under law. But under the Racism Convention, it's quite clear. For example, in one provision, it says, as a factual indicator of racism, that is actionable, if you will, in the administration and functioning of the criminal justice systems around the world. uh, the number and percentage of persons belonging to the racial group who are victims of aggression and other offenses, especially when they are committed by police, etc. The percentage, the comparative percentage of persons who are held in detention is quite probative. So many, in this case, Black people as compared to white. Of course, justification is considered, et cetera, or the proportionality being higher in terms of crime rates, particularly with respect to persons belonging to those groups as regards to petty street offenses related to drugs and prostitution as indicators, if you will, of exclusion and non-integration in such as the larger economic advantages of the society. I could go on, but you see, these kinds of comparative figures, what you find quite clearly, if you look at the figures, and we could talk about the comparative figures if you wish, have probative value in under UN conventions. The other point I want to make is that it matters what the history of policing has been in this country, starting with runaway slave codes and the role that what eventually became the law enforcement, particularly in the South, starts with the runaway slave codes. And we can talk about the way in which that then develops after the Civil War into Confederate soldiers playing the same role against recently freed slaves, on and on. The numbers, comparative numbers in terms of lynchings. During the Jim Crow South, the regime was one of lynching. And there were, like 100 lynchings more each year. And never were there any arrests or was there any accountability in those cases. Massacres like Tulsa, Oklahoma, in which never anyone was held accountable. Again, I could go on and on, but I don't want to take time except to say I want to frame our discussion about policing tactics and what is the overall very critical context here, which is racial discrimination.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that contribution. Next, Special Rapporteur Calamard.
Thank you very much. I'm just making sure I'm staying in my 2 minutes. So I'm going to say two things. First, I'm the special rapporteur, and it's a pleasure to be here, Justin, because I am an Howard University alumni. So very pleased to be joining you and your students. So very, very quickly, 2 points I want to make. At one level, yes, UN framework, the Human Rights International Framework, has much to contribute, not only on the issue that Gay just raised, but also on the question of the use of force, where under international law, I believe that the standard used for the use of force by the police are far better and more equipped to the societies we live in than those that are currently in use in the United States. Under international law, the use of force must be necessary and proportionate. Under the American system, largely, it must just be reasonable. And it is on the basis of the personal judgment by the police officer as to whether it was reasonable to shoot that the courts are going to assess the act, and in the vast majority of cases are going to determine that there was nothing unlawful being done. So the first, in my view, priority for the United States is to really review the legal framework for the use of force and to adopt what is in place in the international legal system. The second point I want to make is that clearly principle of necessity and proportionality will not be sufficient and by far. These principles are in place in many other countries, and yet you have many or quite a large number of police killings, including those with a strong racism component. Personally, over the last year, I have found the international human rights system profoundly challenged by what we have witnessed, and I have found the American streets far more inspiring in terms of thinking of what to do next rather than the international human rights legal framework. How do we reform institutions whose normal and historical functioning is inherently unjust? Mm-hmm. That to me is a question, and it is a question for which I somehow have doubt that in its current makeup, the international human rights system may not be geared to answer very well. It doesn't mean that the answers cannot be found from within that system, but so far I don't think they have provided that answer. And personally, I have found far more responses over the last 6 months listening to the street and the Black Lives Matter, trying to unpack the notion of defunding and rethinking of policing in a modern society than I have found looking back at 40 years of international human rights work. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Professor Flores.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you to the organizers and to my very esteemed co-panelists. My name is Claudia Flores. I'm the director of the Global Human Rights Clinic at the University of Chicago Law School. The clinic has actually conducted 3 pieces of research now related to our panel. The one that I'll discuss most today is Deadly Discretion, which was an analysis of the 20 largest cities in the United States lethal use of force policies. And in that research, we found that none of the cities that we reviewed were compliant with basic international human rights standards. We also are about to release another report that was covered in The Guardian a couple weeks ago, which is a global review of the 29 wealthiest countries, the largest cities in the 29 wealthiest countries, their laws and policies on lethal use of force. And I will say that we found none of them complied with international human rights standards also. And I say that because I do think that one of the very important contributions of human rights to this issue of abuse of force and discrimination is that the human rights framework provides the proper framing. So it prioritizes human life and all of the rights that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about how the police should be acting towards citizens. Because in the end, this is a government service, right? A government service that is accountable to its citizens and can be rethought and reconceived and eliminated in a certain way. And so what the human rights framework does is it allows us to have the conversation in the right way, which is that this is for the benefit of the public and for the benefit of the citizens. And I take Special Rapporteur Calamard's point very well, which is that the human rights system is not necessarily doing that terribly effectively. But within each country, when we are rethinking how the police should be using force, especially in the context of protests, which is really about facilitating freedom of speech, the ability to object to your government and sort of for the population to hold the government accountable, when we can hold those human rights as the basic standards that we should be using, then we can have the conversation in the correct framework.
Thank you so much for that. Commissioner Ramsey.
Thank you. Charles Ramsey. I've spent my entire adult life in policing, 50 plus years. I started my policing career in my hometown of Chicago, where I joined the Chicago Police Department as an 18-year-old police cadet back in 1968. I served 30 years as a member of the Chicago Police Department. I left in 1998 to become police chief in Washington, D.C., where I had the honor of serving for 9 years. From 98 to the beginning of 07. I did retire briefly, but then got back into policing in 2008 when I took over as police commissioner in Philadelphia, where I served for 8 years. In 2015, I had the honor of serving as co-chair of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Currently, I am a member of the court-appointed monitoring team in 2 cities, Baltimore and Cleveland. I serve as an advisor to the U.S. Conference of Mayors and also chair the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency for Governor Tom Wolf. As far as the question goes, I think it would be a move in the right direction here in the United States. It may not be an exact fit, but it certainly puts us in a position to move forward. One thing it would force us to do is create national standards in the area of policy, in the area of training, which is sorely lacking right now. There are almost 18,000 police departments in the United States of America, about 800,000 police officers, about 85% of those departments have 25 or fewer officers. There's no standardization at all. And so in order to do that, you have to start somewhere. And I think that would give us a blueprint to be able to start that process, because I think it's very important that there be some minimal standards, particularly in the area of policy, particularly in the area of training, having a national database of police officers who are terminated for misconduct, for an example, so they can't go from one jurisdiction to another. I mean, there are a host of things that could be done if there were some national standards. I mean, I would go so far as to say even education and training and leadership development and so forth. All those things need to be looked at, and I do believe would be of benefit, not just to police, but to society in general, obviously, if those kinds of steps were taken. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And finally, Special Rapporteur Olay.
You're on mute.
You're on mute. Let's see. Still on mute. I'm having some difficulty with the mute function here. Let's see. There we are.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes, we hear you. Yes. All
yes. Thank you very much, Justin. And I want also to say hello to my fellow panelists and some of you, Agnes and Dugal, that I know. Thank you for also inviting me on this discussion. And I think for me, the first thing that maybe need to be made clear is that the human rights approach to the ending discrimination is not an option. I mean, this is an obligation. Any states, every state has to put in place, has an obligation to put in place measures to end racial discrimination, to protect those who are victims, and also to ensure and to protect also the right to life of every citizen. The same thing also in terms of the police, the use of force, and it's not an option, it's an obligation of the state to put it in place, and United States also, as part of these international norms that is well established, that you just highlight, the Convention on Discrimination. We have also the principle of use of force. All of those standards that exist oblige states also to put in place measures to be able to end racial discrimination, but also the use of force by the police. And I think for me, it's an obligation, but also it's a choice of good policy. It's not optional. It's a choice of good policy because it's had got a lot of advantage. If we think about currently the United States case, which we mentioned extensively, Agnes and I, to the authority, I think it's important today that using this international framework will help the United States to really create this kind of national framework that you are talking about in order to enhance and to end this long-standing and long battle of ending racism in the United States. And it also offers, in my perspective, it also offers the activists, racial discrimination activists, another kind of layout and platform and avenue to be able to express themselves in a country where you know that there is the institution, let me say that, the institution and the structure, racial structure, discrimination structure does not allow really minorities to be able also to access to remedies. So this international platform offer them the voice to be able also to talk, to be able also to bring their issues, but also to be able also to engage with the state. And again, I would like also to mention that with the United States commitment now to come back to the Human Rights Council, I think this also by really using this international framework, opening up the country for the international assistance in terms of drafting the national framework that respect and consistent with the international framework, it also gives the legitimacy for the United States to be able also both to include this ending racial discrimination in its own foreign policy. As you know, after the George Floyd, the George Floyd issue, we know that all the protests that happened, it also raised a lot of concern around the commitments of the United States to really end racial discrimination. And today, this commitment, coming back to the Human Rights Council and taking action at the national level, will also legitimize the United States by also speaking to other countries on how they can also, why they can also do efforts on their side to be able also to end this. And I think that for me, human rights approach is not just an option; it is an obligation. And ending the use of force by police is also an obligation, and the United States also is bound by this obligation also.
Thank you so much for that contribution. I want to take the moderator privilege and ask this question actually to everybody. I think it's such an urgent question, which was raised by the last comment. What can the international community do? What role should the international community play in these issues around race and policing in the United States? We have a number of special rapporteurs. Gay has worked for years in leadership at CERD and on other levels. I'm just very curious as to what role should the international community play? Is it seen as meddling in domestic affairs? Is it primarily a intellectual ideas generation role, giving recommendations that could be good ideas? Is there an enforcement role? What have you seen in your experience? And I think we probably should start with the people who have been specializing in that, so special rapporteurs and Ray McDougall. What have you seen be effective in terms of your role in getting the international community to be part of this solution? And what should the international community's role be in this crisis? Gay, you want to start?
Well, I do want to start because I was part of the effort to put the, if you will, the George Floyd matter before the Human Rights Council. And I did this in the 1 year break when I was a civil society leader, just to not say I switched hats, but, and, you know, it is a test. Now, the other thing is that, of course, we had a different administration when we did that, when we put it before the Human Rights Council, which made a lot of difference.
Okay, could you clarify for the audience what you're referring to? I think you're referring to last year, there was the creation of was it a special mission?
Okay, let me just say, it was what we asked for. We asked that the Human Rights Council hold a special debate, which is something, you know, it's a term of art inside the UN, a special discussion, if you will, unusual format, and that it result in a creation of a commission of inquiry. Again, a special entity that would have special investigative powers, would allow the international community named, you know, there would be independent investigator's name, would have a budget, and would be able to actually hit the ground in the United States and talk to a range of relevant actors and do a proper investigation and come up with some recommendations that would be far more specific and to the issues here than other mechanisms that have to speak generally to a global conditions, if you will. And for a lot of reasons that may or may not be useful to describe here at this time, the whole thing was watered down. We got a special debate, not a special session, and the resolution was not quite as pointed. Instead of this kind of special mechanism with investigative powers and budgetary powers, that's the point. What we got was a request that the High Commissioner of Human Rights do a report that included a global look at relevant problems around the world. Of course, the U.S. would be a specific focus, also Brazil, France, where a number of similar events were going on. But one of the reasons why we got it watered down has been the particular aversion of U.S. Foreign policy agents to allow the U.S. to be named specifically and to be the target of special investigation in the U.S. And that was particularly important to the last administration. So we'll have a report. It will not be something that will have the special investigative budget or authorities. It will cover also other countries, not just looking at all of the very specific and troubling events in the US, et cetera. So to get to your point directly, I think we have to have the U.S. step back in its foreign policy and say, we're going to be honest, we're going to be transparent, and we're going to subject ourselves to scrutiny, international scrutiny, and being held accountable. And we're not going to block efforts at accountability because it is the only way also that we can, with integrity, credibility, call other countries to be accountable. There are a lot of other things we need to do. I mean, we on the international side need to step up again. I think it was very important, the statements that have come out from the rapporteurs, speaking directly as directly as possible to the issues as they see them here. And I think it is very important that we at the international level think of ourselves as also in the business of empowering national civil society actors to play their best role in holding their own governments to account and seeing that changes are made.
Thank you, Gay. That was a great contribution there, and I think that really frames this discussion. Actually, Commissioner Ramsey, I wanted to see if you had any reactions before we speak to special rapporteurs or the professor. Do you think that police commissioners, and in your experience and your lengthy experience in analyzing police departments and working for reform, do you think that there is openness to that type of transparency, or do you think that they can be influenced by international human rights recommendations? Because as you said, there's a great deal of independence when it comes to policing on the local level. And oftentimes, we do not have a national standard. So it is in the hands of these 18,000 police chiefs to be responsive at the moment. Do you think this is a workable plan?
I think you'd find a lot of police chiefs and commissioners that would be open to that approach. Of course, there'd always be some that would be resistant, like anything else. But I think holding policing, but not just policing. I know we're here to focus on that. But when you start talking about human rights abuses, it certainly goes beyond just policing in the United States. And so we need to take a more comprehensive approach and a comprehensive look. And just like the United States is quick to hold other countries accountable for human rights abuses that occur in their countries, then we should be open to having that same level of scrutiny here. But there's a certain amount of arrogance in America where, we feel comfortable telling other folks what to do, but we're not too comfortable having people take a look at us and tell us what we ought to be doing. And we've got to find a way to overcome that. If we don't, we're going to be having this panel discussion over and over and over again because nothing's going to really change. There are countries that can do things better than we do in the United States. They have a different approach on how to, whether you're talking about healthcare, you could be talking about policing, you could be talking about a variety of things where we could actually learn if we're open to learning. And in policing, we need to be open to different ideas. We need to be open to listening to our own communities, and see policing through the eyes of those being policed. And if we were able to do that, then that by itself would go a long way toward correcting many of the things that plague us today. And so I think is that reluctance to be open, which isn't just a policing problem, it is an American problem to a large extent. We all need to think differently, and we need to be open to new ideas. We may or may not agree. It may or may not fit perfectly in as it is, but we need to be open. And I'll close with just one use of force. I traveled to Scotland with the Police Executive Research Forum a few years ago to look at the UK and how they handle use of force situations of people that primarily, they don't have gun violence like we do, but they do have problems with edge weapons. Rarely do you hear about them using deadly force in situations like that. So what is it that they do tactically? How do they train differently to be able to de-escalate and resolve the situation short of deadly force? We actually traveled, we learned, came back, put a program in place in the United States that dealt with that specific type of issue. We learned from them. That is what needs to happen on a much larger scale, in my opinion.
Right, thank you. Any comments from any of the special rapporteurs, maybe Special Rapporteur Calamar? Do you have any thoughts?
I think everything has been mentioned from my standpoint.
Okay. Special Rapporteur Ole?
Yes, I agree. Many things has been already mentioned, and let me also reiterate that I think the international community can play an important role by supporting the local processes in US in ending discrimination and police use of force. In particular, UN and the High Commissioner Office. I just wanted to mention that there's a lot of practice where you have country offices of a High Commissioner that support the government to move some critical issue forward. And it's important to mention also that it's not the fact that the UN establishes office in the country is not an indication that the country violates completely human rights. It may be also that country has a specific human rights challenge that need the expertise of the international community to support them. And I think the US opening up for the international community, for the UN, or the High Commissioner to support, it will also provide a kind of platform that the discussion around ending racial discrimination and police use of force is not politicized. It's not about issue about the Republican or Democrat, but it's about issue of human rights. So having an independent oversight body, having an independent body coming also to monitor, also to help the states to move this agenda forward, I think it will also make sure that the agenda is completely taken away from all the political discourse in the country. And I want to emphasize that because I think, for me, the Biden administration commitment today need also to go further in seeking the international, seeking the UN support to move this agenda forward. In particular, in this time that, for me, it seems that US is really divided in many of those issues. You will have then an independent body that can come also to support the efforts that the government will be undertaking around these issues.
Thank you. Professor Flores, I will let you.
Yeah, I guess just to add one thing, the question you asked at the beginning, Justin, can be used for any human rights issue, right? There's always the issue of national sovereignty and countries wanting not to be held accountable. But the international community has such an important role on all human rights issues, because once you do this long enough, you realize that humans are remarkably consistent in the way that we violate each other's rights. And this issue of police abuse of power, really, and in a discriminatory context, is a global issue. And so that comparative perspective is incredibly important. Like I mentioned, the clinic did a review of the wealthiest countries with the most resources. Sweden allows for deadly force against an individual that is suspected of a serious crime, even if that individual doesn't pose a threat at the moment. Japan's use of force law is more than 70 years old. So there are certain patterns that you notice of governments not restricting and cabining police discretion in the right way, and that leads to discrimination and other human rights violations. And as Mr. Ramsey mentioned at the beginning, really looking at how other countries do it. Northern Ireland, for example, has a very human rights compliant law around protest and policing, and because of their history. And they have completely changed the way that they approach protests and think of it as facilitation rather than control and stop. And if that's taken really seriously by the higher levels in a police force, it does make a difference. So the international community has a really important role to play, because this is a US problem, but it's also a global problem.
Yes, and thank you for that. And yeah, I know you had your hand up. I was wondering if
Go ahead.
you might have this one thing I wanted to say. I mean, you mentioned you have Japan, 70-year-old law. You have Ireland. So the global lens, in theory, police could go to either country and get good ideas or bad ideas, but they ensure that they import those ideas that are more tending towards the human rights framework is perhaps the role of the advocate, because we do know that there's been exchange that has also tended to go into the other direction in terms of surveillance and even use of the tear gas. I was a protester in Ferguson, and some of the tear gas canisters used in Ferguson were also used in the situation in Israel, and we had the exchange there. So that we've seen that work on both sides. I just want to mention that. But Gay, I know your hand was up.
No, I mean, I just wanted to point out, especially following on Clement's first point, all of the established offices for technical assistance and monitoring, the UN, are specifically not in what are considered to be developed countries. So it's basically about monitoring and controlling the global South, if you will. And that has its own problems. We're not here today to critique that, but it means that getting that kind of specific assistance in a country like the U.S. is, it's not a part of the overall game plan of the UN. But I will say, I think it might be very useful for civil society, a coalition of law school clinics, to invite a panel of relevant, international actors, or cross-fertilize, bring the chief of police from Northern Ireland. I've been in a number of contexts with the chief of police from Northern Ireland, who was there during the Troubles, and who had to reconstitute the police force after the agreement to end the troubles. And so he had some very useful comments about policing in divided, societies, badly divided societies, how you handle that, how you root that out of police, not just police forces, but policing, the attitudes, etc. That's something that we can do, and we can move it around the country, our country, to the team around our country, to various cities where we get the kind of openness that Chief Ramsey is talking about. We could even have Chief Ramsey as our ambassador to head up the team. So we can get around, I think, some of the blockages that exist within the UN to going further than we can go because of UN, rules and its own sort of bodies.
Yeah. So on that note, special rapporteurs on our panel released a joint statement last month condemning systemic racism and policing in the United States. And that seems like a classic example of an attempt to make an impact going beyond a formal mechanism. I guess I would ask both special rapporteurs, Calamard and Volée, what has happened as a result of your joint statement? Have you found that there has been a response from advocates or from the U.S. government or from local governments? Has that been an effective method of creating change to put that statement out? And have you found there to be some sort of response, or has the response been somewhat sluggish after your joint statement?
Well, Justin, first and foremost, we don't do that for ourselves. So the fact that we may not hear about what people are doing with our statement is not a problem to me. I'm not doing it in order to get validation of any kind. I'm doing it because I know it could be helpful, because I know from my own work and from what I've been told that this kind of statement can be part of a strategy of actions, of an advocacy, that it strengthen the hands of those at the city level in that case, because it was very much focused on, I think, Philadelphia. I do not expect a response, at least not from civil society. If they want to interact, that's great. If they don't, it doesn't matter to me, as long as I've been in touch with them beforehand to make sure that whatever I write, because I took the lead on that particular statement, whatever I recommend is meaningful for the local context. So it's not just about hammering international principle, this and that. It's about making sure that they are meaningful for the people on the ground who will be responsible for working with those principles. That we did. We took a very long time to produce this report because I was very keen to ensure that all the recommendations had resonance with the advocates on the ground. When it comes to the official response, so far we have not received any. They have about 2 months officially to respond to our inquiries. In that particular case, the inquiries was less at federal level and it was more at city level. So I think it's a little bit more complex. But overall, it's important to insist on the fact that we are not the actors of change, ultimately. It's not me who is going to bring changes to the practice of policing in the United States. What I can do is support, is strengthen, is validate, is amplify, is denounce, use my platform to denounce, use my platform to say, hey, you United States, it's not because you are the United States of America that you can avoid being scrutinized. That I can do. The actors of change, and I have all my, solidarity to them, they are the one fighting. They are the one who are gonna, translate those principles so that it is meaningful. I just want to add one more thing. I believe that the President Obama initiative was fantastic. The report was very important. I'm glad that we have one of the person behind it in there. And I think that example is why it is so difficult to reform institutions that have a history. And I'm all for changing tactics. But frankly, given how important that initiative was, given the recommendations that Mr. Ramsey and others came about, the fact that it was a legitimate initiative, and yet, we are 8 years later, and I was just checking, it appears as if only one city has endorsed some or all of those recommendations. So I think, that to me is why it is very complex what we are discussing. It is far more complex than a couple of good tactics. And I mean it with all due respect. We need, of course, to have those avenues of learning, and they will be a way through which change is going to take place. But gosh, it is so much more complex. And coming from a country, France, which at the moment is completely denying that there is racism within the police, completely denying it, accusing those who are saying the police is racist of incitement to violence and criminalizing them. Coming from a country like this, I can tell you it is more complex than a tactical issue.
I just want to give Commissioner Ramsey some space to respond to that. Commissioner, you put together this wonderful report under the Obama administration, and it has been difficult to get adoption. So what are we to make of that? If we're trying to advocate for human rights standards to be adopted, which are even more of a dramatic progressive shift in local police departments, when they're not listening to the United States government's own reports, should we be throwing our hands up? Or, what does that say for us in terms of getting the actual adoption of our ideas and recommendations?
Well, first of all, I mean, and I had this discussion with the president at the time. The only way to get departments to really, pay attention to the recommendations is to have it somehow tied to funding or something, because there's no way of being able to make agencies come into compliance. There's nothing there. And so you have to find a way, and, money's not the answer to everything, but it's the answer to a few things when it comes to trying to get governments to do something, and that's doing it through the funding process or the denial of funding if they don't demonstrate that they are moving in the direction of reform. The other thing I'd like to say that was just mentioned, that Agnes just mentioned, and that is about complexity. And she's absolutely right. Not everything, when we talk about use of force, is due to systemic racism. There are a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about officers who engage in acts of misconduct. Maybe it's in terms of force, maybe it's in terms of other types of misconduct. And we need to pay attention to that, take them all equally serious, but not everything is tied to race. And that's not to deny that some things are, but that's not the only thing. The other thing that by just narrowly looking at it that way, I mean, who do you think police recruit from? They recruit from society in general. There's a problem in our society, period. And that's who we recruit from. Now, we need to do a better job. I think January 6th showed the extremist views. There were policemen there and so forth. We got to do better background checks and all that. But we're drawing from the larger society, and you're not going to fix it until we fix all of it. Trying to think you can fix one and not the other is not really, and I think we all know that, but I think it's also important to always make that part of the conversation. The last pillar that we used in our work with the task force was officer safety and wellness. We have to also look at the mental health of police officers. They are exposed to trauma on a regular basis in many of these cities. I mean, we talk about soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan after a year or two. Try 30 years or 40 years going to homicide scenes, dealing with child rape victims and other types of things. It has an impact. And there needs to be regular mental health checkups with officers to make sure that they're continuing to have the kind of balance and objectivity they need to be able to perform. It's not like a rubber band is wound so tightly that the least little thing happens and boom, it's gone, right? And some of that happens simply because we don't do enough to really deal with the mental health of our officers. So it's a complex problem, a lot of moving parts, and we need to look at all of them if we're really going to have a real impact.
If I can mention one more that we haven't mentioned in terms of complexity, the police unions.
Yep.
And the role that they play in almost guaranteeing, impunity. And, you've got in the White House now a very good union man, and I agree with that in general. But it seems to me that so many of the problems that we face in terms of reforms are blocked by the unions.
Right.
And, the question is there any way around that? And if there is, what kind of a coalition do we have to put together in order to find that way and employ it?
That's a great point. That's my work also focuses on that, and we need to have that international lens on our discussion on police unions. I want to come to Professor Flores because I know you released a report analyzing 20 cities in particular on this issue. What is the scholarship saying on what we need, how we could improve the way that these police departments are performing, and specifically in relation to human rights standards?
So, so the report that we did focused specifically on lethal use of force policies. And I emphasize that because the two pieces of research that we've done are about what is in the written word. So what laws are, what policies are, how things are implemented in a police department is a completely different matter that really requires an area of expertise that's internal, I think. But the reason we did this research is because, that's the beginning, right? If the law doesn't say that things should be done a certain way, if institutional policies, police department policies don't say that things should be done a certain way, then how can you expect police forces to be reacting and organized in a human rights compliant manner? And so what we found in this research is that none of the 20 largest cities in the US had even these basic standards in their written documents, so in laws and in policies. Now, this doesn't tell you how well police departments are performing, right? You could have really excellent management and terrible policies. The flip side is you could have really excellent policies. It's no surprise that LA and some of the larger cities that have been under a magnifying glass because of the way that their police forces act actually had pretty good policies. But in the second piece of research that I was mentioning before, which is titled Global Impunity, which is coming out in a month, we actually did a lot of background research on policies and their relationship to police behavior in terms of lethal use of force. And as Commissioner Ramsey was saying, there's so many factors that go into whether or not police use lethal force. Trauma, their particular identity, the identity of the person that they are, relating with. There are so many factors that really do need to be looked at if we want to really reform police departments. But one of the things I've been very struck by in the research we've done around protests and policing is how much the institutional messaging matters, how police think of themselves in relation to the population that they are serving. And if they think of themselves as in an antagonistic relationship to the population that they're serving, that seems to be a game changer. And that's why we looked at lethal use of force policies, because that's, the proportionality and necessity, these two principles are supposed to guide the police officer in the moment as to how they should be thinking about lethal force. And then the legality and accountability prongs are really about what happens when things go off the rails, and then also what commitment the government has to abiding by these principles in the first place. So it's so complex, and I think that so many times, media will reach out and they want us to say, how can you make police departments act in a certain way? I think that's really, that's the cooperation of many. The one thing that I can say is that globally and in the United States, we don't see the basic standards we would expect in laws and policies. And that already seems like a huge problem.
Thank you. Well, we hit the 5-minute mark. We know that there's a continue the conversation link that I believe has been inserted into the chat. So for those who want to continue the conversation, and I know I have a number of questions here that came from the audience that unfortunately we didn't have time to ask, but thankfully we will have about 30 minutes after the session for those who want to speak directly to the panelists. Panelists, so in 45 seconds, final words for us to take as we seek to create change. We'll start with Special Rapporteur Calamard. Any parting words?
Sorry, I was just making sure I can get to the next session. I think the point made by Mr. Ramsey were absolutely spot on in my view. We need to integrate police reform within a broader context, health, education, and so on. We need to use funding as a stick and as a carrot. I know the defund the police slogan was, not always well taken. I think if you move beyond the rhetoric, there is a lot of meaningful proposals behind it. And that, to me, some of the very important steps that we have to take to reestablish a balance between some of the over-policing of some menial actions by, most of the times, vulnerable communities, and put more investment somewhere else. Sorry, my phone is, so I'll stop now.
Yes, thank you, Professor Flores.
I think I'll use the time to cede to my co-panelists.
Right, Commissioner Ramsey.
Well, first of all, it was an interesting conversation, and I appreciate it. But like all panels that I have been on, they rarely result in any kind of concrete action. And at some point in time, the conversation has to stop and action has to start. And that has to come from the highest levels of our government here in the United States to really put in place those mechanisms, despite the political blowback or whatever, to start actually instituting real change and demanding that it happen, not making it optional, but actually making sure that it takes place. It's going to take a lot of courage, but it has to be done. But we have such short attention spans in America about so many different issues. Gun violence and mass shootings right now is on the front burner. Why? Because of the Atlanta and because of Boulder, Colorado. I guarantee you this time next week, that won't be the conversation. It'll be something else. And so we'll move on from any kind of meaningful discussion followed by action around, guns and violence in our community to something else, which is the next hot topic. We've got to stop that and settle down and figure out, what these problems are, what are these issues, what are the solutions, and really start taking concrete steps to deal with it, or else we'll all be in the business of sitting on panels for the foreseeable future.
We do not want that.
Yeah, no, I think it's important also to mention that there is already today an important opportunity to move this agenda forward with the Biden administration. I'm saying this because of the contact that I keep having since we have our joint statement, and yes, mentioned we are still waiting for the US formal response, but I keep contact with the permanent mission here, and you can see that there is commitment to move this agenda. We know that national processes are very complicated, but I think that the fact that today the government is committed, recognize that the police use of force is a problem, a systemic issue in the US, is an important tool. That's why my mandate requests also to visit the US, and I'm in discussion with the government to see when will be the appropriate time, because I think this is what our add value, to be able to analyze, to assess the situation and provide independent view to the government on how to move those agenda forward and remove it for the political discussion. For me, it's important because we are talking about human rights, and we intend to mix it sometime with Democrat policy, Republican policy. We need to move this as a human rights issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Day, only a few seconds left.
Well, it's hard to sum up anything after all that's been said so far. But I will say that both the internationals of us and the domestic approach of us have a lot of work to do. But ultimately, we are about creating change on the ground in all of the countries that we speak to. And while the UN, we have limited, mandates and all of that, but we do have to figure out a way to make things move forward. As to, our specific domestic situation here, I think that we have got to, yes, things have to happen from the White House. But we civil society have to give the White House the political backing that it needs. And that means we continue to make loud demands on the government to move forward on this. And, we got to keep those demands up, even if we do have a good government in place. And we have to make sure that all of these international pronouncements filter down somehow to all of the stakeholders in our community. And I think that we on the domestic human rights side don't do that as much as we should. We talk up to the UN.
Yeah, talking across. Well, thank you all. This was a wonderful panel. I've got a notebook full of notes, and I'm looking forward to the post chat. So thank you all of those who were able to hang on. And I think what you do now is we click on this Zoom link to go to the next, I guess, after party here, and I'll see everybody there.
Hi.
Great, thank you.